He entered my courtroom with a smile and the confidence that I couldn't do anything to him. The son of the director of an elite school laughed in my face, thinking that his father's name would solve everything. But what I said to him that day completely changed his path. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The morning the boy walked into my courtroom, I felt the air change before I even saw him. I've spent decades on the bench, and sometimes you can sense when the room is holding its breath. People sat differently, leaned forward differently, whispered with a kind of restrained urgency. Parents from the prestigious Lorenz Academy were crowded into the benches. Teachers looked like they had dragged their nerves here, along with their bodies. Police officers sat stiffly in the back row, avoiding each other's eyes. Even the journalists who slipped in through the side door seemed unusually alert, as if waiting for a storm to break. And when he finally appeared, I understood why. Evan Lorenz pushed open the courtroom door with the careless confidence of someone who has never had to open a door gently in his life. He didn't pause to take in the space or acknowledge that dozens of eyes had turned toward him. He didn't even look up from his phone. He walked with the unhurried arrogance of a boy who believed time belonged to him, and that this courtroom, these people, even I on the bench, were merely obstacles to be dismissed or pushed aside. He wore a jacket that cost more than what some families spend on rent. His shoes were immaculate, as if he had walked from a chauffeured car to this courtroom without ever touching a real sidewalk. A watch flashed on his wrist, expensive, imported, unmistakably meant to signal status rather than tell time. But none of that mattered as much as the expression on his face. There was a smirk there, a small one, almost lazy, like he was watching a slow, boring performance and waiting for the part where he could step in and take control. He didn't see a courtroom. He didn't see a judge. He saw a stage he believed he owned. He dropped into the defendant's chair with a kind of practiced indifference, one leg thrown over the other, thumb still tapping his screen. And as I looked at him, I felt something I rarely feel with juvenile defendants' distance. A distance not of age, but of worlds. He didn't simply come from privilege. He came from a system that had wrapped itself so tightly around him that responsibility had become a foreign language, spoken only by people he didn't think he'd ever have to understand. Around him, the room reacted in ways they probably didn't even notice. A mother in the second row lowered her eyes, ashamed of her own fear. A teacher's shoulders tensed, as if bracing for the backlash of simply existing in the same room as this boy. One of the officers who had arrested him pressed his lips together, a gesture I recognized from men who've been warned to proceed carefully. It was painfully clear that many in this room had crossed paths with the Lorenz family before, and those paths had not been equal. I had read the incident report that morning, but paper couldn't capture the full story. Evan had been tearing through the parking lot of his school, spinning his wheels for the amusement of friends who filmed him on their phones. A younger student had stumbled backward, trying to get out of his way, and had fallen hard. Evan didn't stop. He didn't even open the window. When officers pursued him, he tried to outrun them within the school grounds, no less, before finally braking so abruptly that the tires shrieked across the pavement. When they approached him, he refused to get out of the vehicle, screamed into his phone for his father, and threw the same line over and over again. "You can't touch me. You don't know who my father is." It wasn't a new phrase. I had heard it from others over the years, the sons of politicians, developers, officers. But hearing it from this boy, watching his posture, his expression, made the words feel heavier than usual. Not because he believed them. Many boys believe their parents can save them. The difference with Evan was that, from the looks on the faces in that courtroom, everyone else believed it too. When the clerk finished reading the charges, I looked at Evan. He didn't meet my eyes. He just kept tapping his phone, an exaggerated reminder that none of this mattered to him. "Mr. Lorenz," I said. He didn't look up. A murmur drifted through the crowd, quiet, nervous, resigned. I spoke again, louder. "Mr. Lorenz." Slowly, as if granting a favor, he raised his eyes and leaned back further in his chair. He didn't say a word. His silence was intentional, calculated. I had seen grown men use the same tactic when they wanted to assert control. I hadn't expected to see it in a 17-year-old boy. The prosecutor stood and began listing the details of the case. As she spoke, she opened a folder and laid out additional documents. Incident reports from the school, complaints from parents, internal disciplinary notes that had mysteriously never made it into official records. The more she revealed, the more the faces in the gallery shifted. A teacher dropped her gaze. Another parent tightened his grip on the bench. Someone exhaled sharply, as if relieved these pages had finally seen daylight. What caught my attention most was not the list itself, but the pattern. Every serious infraction had been resolved internally. Every complaint had been misunderstanding. Every confrontation had been handled. You could almost see the invisible hands that had swept these documents clean, polished the edges, removed the stains. And then the courtroom doors opened again. I didn't need an introduction to know who the man was. His entrance said everything. Director Samuel Lorenz moved with the self-assurance of someone used to being listened to before he even spoke. He didn't take a seat. He didn't wait for the clerk to quiet the room. He stood near the front, his posture straight, his gaze fixed on me. Behind him, several teachers flinched instinctively, as if bracing for retaliation they couldn't yet see. He was polite enough to mask his intentions, but not skilled enough to hide the pressure beneath his smile. He began speaking about reputation the schools, the cities. He mentioned student futures, donor expectations, academic excellence. He wrapped his arguments in the language of public good, but the core message was unmistakable. This case should disappear. I listened, not because I agreed, but because listening reveals truths people don't mean to show. And what I saw was not a father defending his son. It was a man defending a kingdom he feared was beginning to crack. When he finished, I turned to Evan. The boy's smirk had returned, sharper now. He believed everything his father said. He believed this would end with a handshake and a quiet dismissal, just like the dozens of times before. But the weight of the room told a different story. Teachers who had been silenced, parents who had been pressured, officers who had been warned. Evan wasn't just a reckless boy. He was a symbol of a structure designed to protect itself at the cost of truth. I took a breath, feeling the stillness of the room settle around me. "Mr. Lorenz," I said, not to his father, but to the boy. "You are responsible for your actions." The smirk faltered. I continued reading the sentence. Community service in a center for victims of traffic accidents, mandatory participation in an offender program, counseling, loss of driving privileges, and bi-weekly progress reports. A shock rippled through the courtroom, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. A silent, collective intake of breath. Evan stared at me as if I had spoken in another language. His father's face hardened, not with surprise, but with the cold anger of someone unaccustomed to being denied. He opened his mouth to protest, but I raised a hand before he could speak. In that moment, I watched a powerful man realize that influence has limits, and more importantly, that he had finally reached one. The noise outside the courthouse grew as people left. Whispers, hurried steps, overwhelmed faces. Some were afraid of what would come next. Some were relieved. Some were simply stunned. But I knew the real storm would not come from the public. It would come from inside the Lorenz household, from the collapse of a structure that had stood too long unquestioned. And as I left the bench that day, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever happened next, neither the boy nor his father would ever walk into a courtroom the same way again. The first cracks had formed. The rest would follow. In the days that followed the sentencing, I found myself thinking about Evan more than I expected. Not because of the punishment I had given him, nor because of the reaction his father had displayed, but because of the expression on his face when I read the final words of the sentence. It wasn't anger. It wasn't indignation. It was confusion. Pure, stunned confusion, as if I had broken a rule of the universe he believed was absolute. It was the look of a boy encountering a reality he never imagined he would have to face. That look stayed with me. I had seen defendants leave my courtroom with fury, humiliation, fear, even relief, but very rarely with the expression of a child who has just realized the world is not shaped around him. And as the first week of his community service approached, I wondered which version of Evan would show up. The arrogant prince of Lorenz Academy, or someone beginning, however reluctantly, to feel the weight of accountability. On the morning he was scheduled to report to the Victim Center, the director of the program called me. She had worked with offenders for over 20 years and never sugar-coated her observations. She told me Evan had arrived on time, which she hadn't expected. But the way he stood in the lobby, as if the room offended him, was exactly what she had predicted. He had his hands in his pockets, shoulders squared, chin lifted slightly, performing confidence even as his foot tapped nervously against the floor. It was the posture of a boy pretending he was still in control. She told me he barely spoke when introduced to the staff, nodding curtly, without removing the headphones draped around his neck. When he was assigned basic tasks, stacking supplies, organizing pamphlets, cleaning tables, he completed them with a deliberate slowness, as though the work itself were beneath him. He wasn't overtly hostile. He wasn't openly defiant. But everything in his movements communicated resistance. Still, he did the tasks. And to people like us, who spend our careers seeing every possible expression of defiance, that meant something. A reluctant step is still a step. His real test came later that afternoon. The center regularly held group sessions for families affected by reckless driving parents who had lost children, children who had lost parents, siblings whose lives had been fractured by a single moment of negligence. Offenders in the program were required to sit through these sessions, listen, and absorb the reality of what their actions or potential actions could cause. Some listened, some didn't. But everyone came away changed, even if they didn't realize it immediately. Evan entered that room with his shoulders hunched, his eyes focused on the floor. When he sat down, he picked a chair as far from the group as possible, leaning back with deliberate disinterest. But the moment the first parent began to speak, something subtle shifted in him. It wasn't visible to most people, certainly not to the boy himself, but it was clear enough to the program director, who later recounted the scene to me in vivid detail. A mother, soft-spoken, exhausted by grief, described losing her teenage son because a speeding driver had taken a turn too quickly. She didn't raise her voice, didn't point fingers, didn't speak with anger. Instead, she described the ordinary pieces of her life that had become unbearable since the crash. The untouched notebooks on her child's desk, the empty chair at the dinner table, the silence in the house that used to be filled with laughter. As she spoke, Evan's posture changed. His foot stopped tapping. His jaw tightened. His eyes shifted away from the window and toward her, not fully focused, but listening despite himself. Another parent described the moment he received the phone call every parent dreads. A grandmother explained how she was now raising her granddaughter alone. A teenage boy told the story of his brother's death with a flat, hollow voice that held no anger, just a numbness far too old for him. Through each story, Evan's expression shifted gradually. No dramatic reaction, no breakdown, no apology. But the smirk he had worn in my courtroom was nowhere to be seen. When the session ended, he didn't rise immediately. He sat still for several seconds, staring at the floor, as if struggling to assemble thoughts he had never had to consider before. When he finally stood, he walked out of the room without speaking. But later that day, he worked faster, with more focus, less visible resentment. The program director was careful not to interpret too much too soon. She had seen offenders show temporary remorse, only to revert to their old behaviors the moment the discomfort faded. But she also told me something unexpected. Evan asked a question before he left, not about his schedule or tasks, but about the teenage boy in the group. He wanted to know how old he was, whether he still played sports, whether he went to school. They were simple questions, but the mere fact he asked them revealed something shifting inside him, something small but unmistakably human. While Evan was beginning to feel the first tremors of change, his father was experiencing a very different kind of upheaval. Within days of the hearing, news outlets began publishing investigative pieces about Lauren's academy. Parents and teachers, emboldened by what they had witnessed in my courtroom, came forward with accounts of intimidation, altered records, pressure to remain silent, even threats disguised as professional guidance. Anonymous sources from the school board confirmed that disciplinary reports involving Evan had been buried for years. Internal emails surfaced, meetings were leaked, a picture formed, not of a prestigious educational institution, but of a fortress built to protect the reputation of one man and his son at any cost. By the end of the first week, the school board announced a formal investigation. By the end of the second, the city's education department joined it. And by the third, the academy's donors, wealthy, influential individuals who cared deeply about public image, began withdrawing their support. The collapse of a powerful man's influence is rarely sudden. It begins quietly, almost imperceptibly, with a single refusal. Then another, and another, until the foundation he built starts to shift beneath him. For Director Lorenz, that shift came when longtime supporters stopped returning his calls. When the board requested access to internal records he had always controlled alone. When teachers he once silenced now spoke freely. And when his own staff avoided his gaze in the hallways, no longer intimidated by the authority he had wielded for decades. News traveled quickly throughout the city. Some celebrated, some feared retaliation, but everyone understood. The Lawrence family's grip on the community was loosening. The first time Evan confronted the reality of his father's unraveling was during one of their brief conversations at home, which the program director later told me about through Evan's own recounting. His father, exhausted and angry, demanded to know what the program was doing to him. Evan responded not with the defiance I had come to expect, but with uncertainty. He didn't know how to articulate the confusion he felt, how the stories at the center had pierced through the armor he'd worn for years, how he could no longer pretend that consequences were optional. His father mistook this for rebellion. He couldn't comprehend that his son was beginning to see the world without the filter of privilege he had so carefully constructed for him. For the first time, their roles reversed. The father clung to denial. The son hesitated at the edge of understanding. Several weeks passed before I saw Evan again. He arrived at my courtroom without his father, without his entourage, without the glare of spectators. He stood straighter than before, not with arrogance, but with a quiet determination. There was no smirk on his face, no phone in his hand. His eyes met mine with a steadiness that surprised me. When he spoke, he did so with calm clarity. He told me that the stories he'd heard at the center had changed the way he thought about driving, about responsibility, about the kind of person he wanted to become. He admitted openly that he hadn't understood the danger he posed, that he had assumed he was invincible because he had never been told otherwise. He said he was angry at his father, not for being punished, but for being protected from the truth for so long. And he said he wanted to finish every hour of his sentence, even if the investigation surrounding his family could have offered him leniency. I listened without interrupting, giving him space to speak at his own pace. His words weren't rehearsed. They came with the uneven cadence of someone speaking honestly for the first time. When he finished, I didn't praise him, and I didn't condemn him. I told him the truth, that accountability begins where excuses end, and that he was learning a lesson most people twice his age never fully understand. When he left my courtroom, I realized something important. The boy who had walked in weeks earlier believing the world belonged to him had returned as someone willing to stand in it, without armor. The investigation into the academy continued for months. Director Lorenz was eventually suspended and later removed from his position. For the first time in his adult life, he faced questions he couldn't silence, consequences he couldn't rewrite, and a community no longer willing to bow to his influence. But even as he struggled with the fall of everything he had built, he did something unexpected, something deeply human. He began, slowly and awkwardly, to listen to his son, not as a director defending an empire, but as a man confronting the truth of his own failures. Evan continued his community service long after the minimum requirement was met. He volunteered at the Victims Center through the summer, helping with events, assisting families, quietly doing work no one expected him to do. The staff told me he never spoke about his father, never looked for praise, never drew attention to himself. He simply worked, and there is something profoundly meaningful about quiet labor work done without applause, without reward, without expectation. It shapes a person differently than punishment ever could. The city eventually moved on to new scandals, new headlines, new stories to debate. But something had changed. People spoke about accountability with a little more confidence. Teachers at the academy felt safer. Parents felt heard. And every time I passed the campus of Lorenz Academy, I thought about how fragile even the strongest walls can be when truth starts to push against them. I didn't see Evan again after he finished the program, not in my courtroom, and not anywhere in the city. But months later, I received a letter from him. He wrote that he had applied to several colleges and had been accepted to one he never thought he deserved. He wrote that he had chosen to study psychology because he wanted to understand how people change and why some people never do. And at the end of the letter, in neat, careful handwriting, he wrote a sentence that stayed with me long after I folded the page and placed it in my drawer. He wrote, "Thank you for not letting me stay the person I thought I had to be. There are many kinds of power in this world: wealth, influence, fear. But none of them compare to the power of a life redirected, a future rewritten, a truth finally acknowledged." Evan learned that lesson the hard way. His father learned it even harder. And I was reminded, once again, why the bench demands more than authority. It demands honesty, courage, and a willingness to hold the line even when the ground beneath you shifts. Because sometimes, all it takes to break a dynasty is one moment of accountability. And sometimes, all it takes to save a boy is the simple refusal to look away. If you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe, watch the next videos on the channel, and share this one with someone who needs to see it.